The following special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you without commercial interruption by our Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg so you can help support the show and keep it going and growing. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and help us help you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance. Now on with the show.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
All right, y'all. Good afternoon. Hope you had meaningful tours this morning, our last tours for the conference. And then we have 2 talks to round out the conference before we have a little celebration tonight. And so my pleasure to introduce my friend, Gerry Prokopowicz. He is the professor of history at Eastern Carolina University. East. It's not Eastern, it's East. Man, that's terrible. East. ECU. East Carolina. How's that? Huh? East Carolina University. Wait, where are you? Can I redeem myself this way? Are you the Pirates? Okay, so there you go. I do know this, Gerry. I have become somewhat of, I wouldn't say expert, familiar with ECU baseball, which I never thought would happen in my life. But because, as you all know, Gerry is the voice of Civil War Talk Radio, he gives us a really nice sort of rundown where they are in the season, as well as for ECU football. Yeah, for both. Gerry has a voice that is made for radio, right? I mean, he truly does. And he just said, I didn't say this. He said, a face made for radio. That's your opinion. That's not mine at all. Gerry is a pioneer before podcasts became a thing that everybody has to have, or you're not a viable human being now unless you have your own podcast. When did you start Civil War Talk Radio? 2004. And he is... There's a certain parallel between CWI and Civil War Talk Radio is that you can see the topics that are discussed, the speakers, their backgrounds, all over the place. With every year, we keep reaching, hearing about things you never would maybe have thought about as being part of Civil War history. I mean, hit on all topics. He's been extremely good to CWI, especially to my students. He just informed me that the kids who are back in the corner showing off their interpretive plans, they're going to be on talk radio this week. Oh, tomorrow night even. Okay, that's fantastic news. So we really appreciate all you've done. You've been a wonderful partner. You've been good to me in my career. There was once, I just have to confess, I can't believe I forgot this. I was scheduled to be on Civil War Talk Radio, and I said, oh my God, I forgot entirely. I said, well, where were you? And I said, I was sitting in my hot tub. Which I probably shouldn't have confessed to here or to you as well. But yeah. Did I tell you I was at a conference at that time? No, I'm going to come clean. I was in my hot tub. That's what I was doing. So Gerry has published a number of books as well, including Did Lincoln Own Slaves? And I believe this was your dissertation, your first book, published by UNC, entitled All for the Regiment, the Army of the Ohio, 1861 to 1862. I just should also note that Gerry served as historian at the Lincoln Library in Fort Wayne. He's going to talk maybe a little bit about that as well. And here again is another example of when you want to try to pigeonhole an academic historian who just wants to talk to his peers and nobody else. Gerry, again, a very long time ago, understood the importance of reaching general audiences, and he's done that through, obviously, Civil War Talk Radio. He's done it with many exhibits and also with his scholarship. It's my pleasure to introduce Gerry Prokopowicz.
Well, thank you very much, Pete. Thank you all for the representation on East Carolina University. The school, the mythical school, Eastern Carolina University, exists only on a T-shirt that you can buy through the Civil War Talk Radio website. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. In 2016, I had a contract with the university press to write a short book about Abraham Lincoln and how he had been remembered in American history up through the present. It was something, let's start moving. It was something that I felt comfortable writing about. I'd studied Lincoln. I'd worked at the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana for 9 years. And through Civil War Talk Radio, I'd interviewed many of the authors of new books about Lincoln for a decade at that point. I was ready to summarize where Lincoln stood as an American symbol. I was comfortable with my understanding that while historians, we disagree among ourselves vigorously all the time, we and Americans generally shared certain understandings on basic values of how the country governs itself, how we conduct our politics. And then things changed. Since the middle of the last decade, every passing month seemed to render obsolete my assumptions about how Americans understood their history and what they valued in it. Some of us will blame one side more than the other for these changes. We're not here to argue that today, but I think most of us will agree things certainly changed a great deal. And as a result, I found it impossible to write a book about how Lincoln was remembered when the assumptions that I held that underlay in large part Lincoln's memory seemed to be crumbling. I'm still not prepared to write that book, but with the return of some semblance of stability, I do feel capable today, at least, of sharing with you a brief review of where we have been in the last 2 decades in terms of remembering Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln himself said in the House Divided speech, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could better judge what to do and how to do it." I certainly don't know whither we are tending, nor what to do or how to do it. But in terms of Lincoln's memory, I will go ahead and share with you my thoughts of where we are today. In terms of Lincoln in popular culture, briefly then something about Lincoln scholarship in the 21st century, and finally some thoughts on the danger that today threatens not just Lincoln studies, but the practice of history generally. At the beginning of the century, the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association published an article by the late Professor Barry Schwartz evaluating Lincoln at the turn of the millennium. He showed how popular images of Abraham Lincoln in the 20th century, in political cartoons and posters, tended to be dignified and respectful. This changed in the last quarter of the 20th century, when the Lincoln image was freely adopted by artists, by advertisers, by anyone who wanted to use the Lincoln image, without much regard for Lincoln's dignity. Movie makers did this. For example, here's a clip of Abraham Lincoln as he appeared in the 1989 movie Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Party on, dudes. The early 21st century saw not just a continuation, but an acceleration of this trend. If you did not have a high opinion of how Bill and Ted treated Lincoln, you would probably care even less for the sketch released in 2007 titled "What Really Happened to Abe Lincoln." If you have seen it, you will know why I'm not going to show all of it to you right now. But for those who haven't, I was able to find a censored version online that we could show in this room. It's grainy, but it'll give you some idea. The premise of the sketch is that Lincoln at Ford's Theater was a rude audience member who deserved his fate. And purists will note that the play on stage is not Our American Cousin, but an adaptation of Shakespeare in which Hamlet is being attacked by Othello, who has turned into a vampire.
For my friend Othello, Oh no! Hamlet, turn around! He turned into a vampire! He's gonna punch you! Oh, Hamlet, I can't watch this! Hey, everybody, I can't watch this!
Well, some of us are trying to.
John, please. Who said that? Which one of y'all dead just said that? Was it you, String Bean? You skinny ass looking Turn around and say it again. Turn around and say it again. Turn around and say it again.
Will you please be quiet?
John.
That's John Wilkes Booth in the front row, who ultimately attacks Lincoln with a hammer. In a more recent take on the assassination, TikTok creator Jake Shane, who takes fan requests to show how someone from Gen Z would respond if they were at critical moments in history, gives us his version of the star of the play at Ford's Theater, and again, it's not our American cousin, calling his mother on the phone the next day.
It went fine. When I was giving that monologue, Lincoln got shot. Yeah, Abraham. Like, I don't know, like, he's in the hospital, but like I got cut off through half my monologue, and there were critics there. And like, there's no way they're gonna let this play go on a second night because like he got shot and stuff, and it's like, what am I
supposed to do? He got shot and stuff. We also see Lincoln in this year's production of History of the World, Part 2, in which he is too tall for every room in Grant's headquarters. But in the rest of the scene, he laughs it off, telling Grant, well, at least that's the worst thing that'll happen to my head this week. What I find significant about these young content creators diminishing Lincoln's dignity is not that they're diminishing the dignity, but that it's Abraham Lincoln who they are choosing to portray. There's abundant evidence that Lincoln remained relevant and recognizable to young Americans in the early 21st century. When TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and movies like Twilight made vampires the monster of the decade, Lincoln was not far behind. The 2010 novel and 2012 movie, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, immediately jumped on board that craze. And what I find particularly interesting about this movie is that it's not a funny movie, despite the title that promises satire. In fact, there was actually a satire made of the vampire movie in the form of a zombie movie, Lincoln and Zombies. But you can't have a satire of something that is itself a satire. Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was more an allegory, substituting slavery and Nazism, replacing them rather with the evils of vampirism. And it traced many of the events that actually occurred in Lincoln's life: his trip to New Orleans, relationship with Anne Rutledge, his time in Congress, the politics of the 1850s. It's clear that Seth Grahame-Smith, the author and creator of the movie, had a serious interest in Abraham Lincoln. Now, in claiming that young people recognize Lincoln, some of them are serious about Lincoln, they know who Lincoln is, that goes against the conventional wisdom that young people today are not learning about Lincoln or about history in general. And in support of this, there was a recent article in the New York Times that made this point, that young people are ignorant of history. A survey shows American freshmen not knowing very much about American history. And when I say recent article, I'm speaking as a historian who takes a long view of things. So by recent, there we go. This would actually be 1943 when this article appeared. There have been other articles since, but the point is that the fear of declension runs deep in American history. The idea that the past was a golden age, today is worse than yesterday. Youth of today are not what their forefathers were. If you go back far enough, you can find this among the Puritan ministers of New England who thought the halfway covenant of 1660 was a disgraceful weakening of standards to accommodate the lazy and impious youth of their day. One might as well ask, has the Lincoln theme been exhausted, as James Randall famously did in 1936, a question to which we know the answer is no and continues to be no, as to ask, are the youth of today different in how much they know about history from the youth of previous generations? Now, so far, all these examples have involved youth, but not all pop culture is for young people. What we've seen so far is, and I'm able to present this only because I was fortunate to have two daughters growing up, attending high school and college in the 21st century, and giving me a lifeline to youth culture. Now that they are adults, 5 years from now, I'll be incapable of offering a new thought on this topic, so we'll have to come to something else. But not all pop culture does belong to young people. When Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was playing in 2012, many older theater goers were going to see a different Lincoln movie, the one with Daniel Day-Lewis. That was a very successful movie, and it in turn was, of course, based on the book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, published in 2005, which won the Lincoln Prize and was a bestseller. Lincoln again topped the bestseller lists in 2017, this time in an experimental magical realism novel called Lincoln in the Bardo, which, like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, combined supernatural elements with a surprising degree of faithfulness to the actual historical record. It's full of quotations from real historical figures. It's full of quotations from real historians, including some who were with us over the past week. But it mixed these historically accurate quotations and characters with completely invented ones, thus blurring the line between history and fantasy. But again, like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, it took Lincoln seriously. It presented him as a deeply grieving father, mourning the loss of Willie, his son, and using his grief and pain to help inspire him to go on to do greater things. Lincoln appeared in other forms of public culture in the early 21st century, museums being another example. The Lincoln Museum of Fort Wayne, Indiana, where I had the opportunity to work for 9 years, was inexplicably closed in 2008 by the Lincoln Financial Group, which had sponsored it since 1928. But the spirit of the Lincoln Museum of Fort Wayne survived. Much of its collection was given to the Allen County Public Library, and it continued to be supported by the nonprofit Friends of the Lincoln Collection. And in January 22, the Friends Group and the library collaborated to open the Ian Rowland Center for Lincoln Research that you see pictured here. Much of the paper collection, the documents, artwork, and other flat objects that were preserved from the collection are now once again on display to the public. It's also open to researchers. So, in spite of Lincoln Financial Group's best efforts to do away with it, the Lincoln Museum in some form still lives. I was speaking here, standing behind this lectern in 2008, not long after the announcement came that the museum was going to be closed. And I was wearing a golf shirt with a Lincoln Museum logo. I was proud of having worked there. But in my distress at learning the museum was closing, I told the audience that day that I would never wear that shirt again. And I've kept my word on that. But now, with the reopening of the Ian Rowland Center for Lincoln Research, if I could have found that shirt, I would have worn it today. Another 21st century Lincoln museum that experienced highs and lows was the one most people are familiar with, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. It opened in 2005 with great fanfare under the direction of the veteran Presidential Museum leader Richard Norton Smith. But Smith had been hired only after the governor of Illinois, before going to jail, I assume, made decided to appoint one of his political cronies, a person with no museum experience, to become the museum's director. This led to an outcry around the country, and instead a panel of historians, again including many of the people we heard from this week, was convened, and they chose Smith to take over instead. So the museum did at least begin with a serious leader. But that would not be the last controversy involving the museum. It drew 1 million visitors within its first 2 years. It drew over 500,000 in 1 year alone, 2009, the Lincoln Bicentennial year. But attendance then leveled off until it plunged, of course, in 2020 with the pandemic. This decline was coincident with more administrative chaos. 2 more directors came and went. One was fired after being arrested for shoplifting. Another was fired after lending the museum's, one of the museum's greatest treasures, an original copy of the Gettysburg Address, to a radio talk show host without making any appropriate provisions for protecting it and guaranteeing its safety. One of the museum's most treasured artifacts, a stovepipe hat allegedly belonging to Abraham Lincoln, had its provenance called into question. Was it really Lincoln's hat? The museum was eventually had its administration restructured, but then in an event hard to imagine within the museum world, in 2021, it parted ways with the foundation, the charitable foundation that had been created decades earlier to help bring the museum into existence, and which also owned many of the museum's artifacts, including the controversial hat. There are people who were here this week, people may still be in this room, who know more about this bizarre turn of events than I do. But there may be reason for hope in Springfield. Visitation has returned close to its pre-pandemic levels, and the museum now has a director with legitimate credentials in the field of history and museum direction. So perhaps things will improve. Springfield was also, in 2008, the place where presidential candidate, future President Barack Obama began his campaign. He would later use the same Bible that Lincoln did for his inauguration, and thus carried on the tradition, echoed in the words of Senator Everett Dirksen 50 years earlier, that every American politician's first duty is to get right with Lincoln. President Obama made no mistake about that through imagery and language, that he was very willing to associate and be associated with Abraham Lincoln. And this made sense because Lincoln still topped presidential polls going through the 21st century. In 2000, 2009, 2017, 2021, C-SPAN polls all showed Lincoln still at the top. Barry Schwartz argued in the article I mentioned at the start that the consensus in favor of Lincoln in these polls had begun to diminish over the course of the 20th century. He noted, for example, that Lincoln had a smaller percentage of people putting him in the top 3 in 1956 than he did in 1999. But one's immediate response to that is Lincoln had more competition in 1999. 35% of the voters put John F. Kennedy in the top 3 in the 1999 poll, whereas 0% did that in 1956, obviously before Kennedy's presidency. So what is remarkable to me is not that Lincoln's share might be declining in an ever-growing pool, but the consistency with which we see him number 1 4 times in a row throughout the 21st century, even in a nation as increasingly divided as ours. During the 2012 presidential election, to return to the youth culture motif we started with, the YouTube series Epic Rap Battles of History, which features imaginary verbal conflicts between famous people, did an episode with candidates Mitt Romney and Barack Obama slinging insults at each other. But when they go from clever rapping to simple playground insults, when their rhetoric falls below the standard, the person that the creators choose to fix things, brought in by a giant eagle, is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. He berates one of them and then the other, both to do better, and then flies away. So when the creator of music and art, again, aimed at a younger audience, wanted to demonstrate a representative of a higher standard of politics in 2012, Abraham Lincoln remained the natural choice. So we've looked at what people have been watching. What about what people have been writing in the 21st century, both academic and popular historians? There has been no slacking in the quantity of books produced in the 21st century. This 3-story tower of books appears at the Ford's Theater Center for Education and Leadership that opened in 2011. The books are not real. It's not an actual tower, like a Jenga tower. You pull a book off the bottom and the whole thing falls down. They are aluminum reproductions of books, but it's still quite impressive if you can go see it. The quality of scholarship, likewise, has grown in the 21st century, but in a steady upward fashion. Each book has added another brick to the wall. New topics have been tackled, new angles added to discussions of the assassination or the election of 1860, the Cooper Union Address. What we haven't seen in this decade were the kind of sudden upward leaps of paradigm-shifting books that appeared in the previous quarter century, when books like Gabor Borit's Abraham Lincoln and the Economics of the American Dream changed the way people discussed Lincoln and economics. Or Alan Gelzo's Redeemer President caused historians for the first time in many years to take Lincoln's religious views and thinking and philosophy seriously. Or Rodney Davis and Douglas Wilson resuscitating Herndon's Informants, the body of material that William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, had collected, which historians had largely scorned. They revitalized it, published it, edited and published it, made it available. Another example, the Lincoln Legal Papers Project that collected all the legal documents Lincoln had generated in his career in Illinois, that was expected initially to fill a volume but turned out to be enough to fill hundreds of volumes. Eventually they settled on, I think, several dozen CDs, and then when DVDs were invented, they compressed it into 2 DVDs. This, in contrast to these kinds of breakthroughs, the scholarship of the early 21st century was more a case of steady accretion. But it was not for lack of trying that the Lincoln paradigm was not shattered in the 21st century. 3 authors in particular, none of them trained historians, made determined assaults on the image of Abraham Lincoln. One of them was Thomas DiLorenzo, an economist, who led a libertarian-themed attack on Abraham Lincoln in his book, The Real Lincoln, a new look at Abraham Lincoln, his agenda, and an unnecessary war. This was published in 2002. It sold widely. It is still frequently cited by your neighbor who has read one book about Lincoln and wants to tell you that he knows the real story behind everything. If he's an exceptional reader, he will have read a second book, which would be Killing Lincoln, attributed to Bill O'Reilly, published in 2011, in which case he will also tell you that he knows Stanton was behind the assassination. Neither of these books had any impact on serious Lincoln scholarship, since they didn't provide any meaningful evidence for their authors' theories. But their popularity was a disturbing indication of how easily people could be misled by historical propaganda that conformed to their worldviews. A second attempt to change the way that Lincoln was perceived in the early 21st century was encapsulated in a book by C.A. Tripp called, that was published posthumously in 2005 and called The Intimate World of Abraham Lincoln. The basic argument of the book was that Lincoln was gay, taking up a case made in the 1990s by Larry Kramer and others. Kramer was a political activist, not a historian, best remembered in the Lincoln world for propagating the hoax that he had found Joshua Speed's diary. At the time when Tripp's book came out and in the years preceding it, and this is in a way that's hard to even recall and would be impossible, I think, for young people here who weren't there at the time to imagine, the issue of gay marriage was a hot-button issue, and opposition to it was still strong throughout the country. Unlike DiLorenzo, Tripp succeeded in convincing at least one reputable historian that he had a case, but the lack of anything but circumstantial evidence left most historians wary. And then within 10 years, the evolution of public opinion and of Supreme Court opinions took the fervor out of the debate. Today, the question, did Lincoln really love Joshua Speed, is on about the same level as did Lincoln really love Anne Rutledge. It's of interest to Lincoln enthusiasts who can argue about it indefinitely because there's no conclusive evidence, but the general public is not much interested. The third challenge to the standard view of Abraham Lincoln came from Lerone Bennett with the publication in 2000 of the book Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. Bennett pointed out that historians traditionally excused Lincoln whenever he said anything that sounded racially inappropriate to modern ears by saying, well, he's a practical politician. His voters are racist white Americans and he has to appeal to them. But whenever Lincoln said anything that sounded acceptable, like if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong, then those historians said, now that's Lincoln's true spirit speaking. What Bennett did was flip this script around. What if, he said, Lincoln really was committed to white supremacy, and he only spoke for freedom and equality as a cynical political expedient? This was something that Bennett had been thinking about a long time. In 1968, he wrote an article for Ebony magazine called "Was Abe Lincoln a White Supremacist?" It was something that he had come up with because at the time, as a young person interested in civil rights, he wanted to see if Lincoln was a historical hero he could admire. He read the 8 volumes collected volumes of Lincoln's works and was appalled to discover that Lincoln was a man of the 19th century with 19th century opinions that didn't seem fully appropriate in the 20th century. Well, Bennett's idea that Lincoln was hiding a secret racial animus while pretending to be anti-slavery is preposterous. But what was not preposterous was the way Bennett had showed us all how easy it was to manipulate Lincoln's words, how you could craft a Lincoln who appeared to be anti-slavery at heart by interpreting every utterance of Lincoln in the traditional way, and you could just as easily create a bizarro anti-black Lincoln by interpreting them 180 degrees away. This opened the door for historians to think more carefully and deeply and subtly about Lincoln and race, and to write better and more interpretive books about the topic in the 21st century. It also did, however, lay the groundwork for those who were losing their reverence for historical figures and historical interpretations, who were ready to challenge ideas such as the lost cause, but also the reverence for Abraham Lincoln later in the century. That change, that willingness to look differently at the past, came along at the same time as two developments that I think create a certain element of danger for the future of Lincoln studies and history as a whole. The first of these is the astonishing growth of information technology. On the surface, technology has been a boon for Lincoln studies. The internet has increased source access since 2000 in unimaginable ways. A few examples. Harp Week is the digitized version of Harper's Weekly. It won the E. Lincoln Prize in 2003, the best electronic project. I recall when the makers of this were scanning the pages of the Harper's Weekly collection at the Lincoln Museum where I worked, watching our curator carefully take apart the issues so they could be scanned, put back together, and then made available in a searchable format. It seemed miraculous at the time. It took a lot of effort and was priced accordingly. It was initially very expensive to have access, but today you can get it free online. Likewise, the Lincoln Legal Papers Project, eventually published under the title The Law Practice of Abraham Lincoln, was initially prohibitively expensive, thousands of dollars. Only libraries could afford it. I recall getting a review copy when I worked at the Lincoln Museum and thinking, I am in the money here. But again, today, since 2009, the entire contents have been available to everyone online at no charge. Most of all, the collected works of Abraham Lincoln began digitizing in 1998, or completed soon afterwards. It is literally impossible to imagine studying Lincoln today without access to this remarkable tool that allows us to search everything Lincoln ever wrote. Historians are continuing to use technology in remarkable ways. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story recently announced of how Christopher Oakley of Western Carolina University, and that is Western, not West, Western Carolina, came up with a way to create three-dimensional models using the photographs of the Gettysburg Address event. And by triangulating these models, these photographs created a three-dimensional model that allowed him to pinpoint exactly where the speaker's stand must have been located on that day in November 1863, something that had been a mystery for the previous 150 years. There are all kinds of other digital tools that historians use. Ancestry.com includes newspapers.com. It includes Fold3 for military records. There's the National Park Service's Civil War soldiers and sailors database. There is digital history and communication available through things like Civil War Talk Radio and other podcasts. There are numerous podcasts available now where authors can reach large audiences and make them aware of books that they otherwise might not have even heard of. There are echoes of electronic technology even in the paper, printed books that we see in the 21st century. For example, Michael Burlingame's Abraham Lincoln, A Life, published in 2 massive volumes, was originally conceived to be 4 massive volumes, but Professor Burlingame's publisher said that was not practical to do. He went ahead and edited down to 2, but didn't want to give up the 4-volume version, so with the cooperation of the Lincoln Studies Center at Knox College in Illinois, you can now read all 4 volumes in their original form, plus hundreds of pages of additional footnotes that don't appear in the paper version. You can read them online. So if this book, Abraham Lincoln, A Life, shows how electronic technology has made it possible to do away with limitations and make books as long as you want them, at the other end of the scale, we have Southern Illinois University's Concise Lincoln Library. These books are short, their format is fixed, their content is varied, As soon as you finish one, you're ready to start the next. They are essentially the TikTok of the Lincoln world. With all these benefits of Lincoln studies, of technology for Lincoln studies, there have been some drawbacks. The introduction of any new technology will always leave some members of the population confused and dismayed. Further, the ability to spread information implies the ability to spread disinformation. Lincoln himself warned us about the potential unreliability of material found online. Now, we could always laugh at sophomores misquoting Lincoln in a term paper because they went to an unreliable website. And of course, Lincoln was misquoted freely long before the internet came into being. But as technology has become more sophisticated, the risks have increased.
77 years ago, our ancestors dreamed that we would build our family tree and make fascinating discoveries about our family history.
Now that deep fake commercial is not nearly as impressive as what the actual Lincoln said about Harold Holzer in Catherine Clinton's presentation earlier this week. But they both show that Lincoln can be made to appear to be a living, breathing person being recorded. Now, we don't worry about deep fakes of Abraham Lincoln because we know there are no actual videos of him. But any tool that makes it harder to distinguish between reality and imagination carries risks for writers and readers of history. That became very clear in the last few months with the sudden rise of artificial intelligence as a serious topic of discussion. It seems only a matter of time before some AI controversy breaks out in the Lincoln world. I had my first experience with AI this past semester when students turned in book reviews in an introductory level U.S. history survey course, and 6 of the reviews out of 46 submitted used the word nuanced. That was 6 times more than I had seen the word nuanced in the previous 19 years of teaching. Now, each student was reviewing a different book, so the content was different, but the style of all the reviews was eerily similar. And it turned out the students, when confronted with this, said they had used a software tool, I think it was Grammarly Plus. That's a software that originally was useful for correcting grammar, the way spell check and Microsoft Word can fix your grammar as well as your spelling. But now it can change a piece's style to sound more professional. That was what these students had done. They had attempted to sound more professional by using this, and the result, without knowing any content, my graduate assistant who had read all these said, and this is his quote, so pardon it, "These all read like grad student bullshit." They were light on content, but they sounded confident, and they said things like, "This book makes a substantial contribution to the field." Now, when the writer is a first-year construction management major who has never read an academic history book, the idea that they know what contributes to the field seemed unlikely. So there's a danger. People will use these tools. If it's just to correct your spelling, fine. But at what point do they begin to impinge on style and eventually content? I think the Lincoln world and the history world will be finding out soon enough. Some scandal is bound to occur. And if technology is one of the developments, it suggested there were 2 that lead us toward danger. The other one is the willingness to use the tool, not to spread knowledge or increase knowledge, but to obscure truth, to obscure knowledge. Social media has allowed us to communicate, to share sources and ideas, to debate, to do all the things that historians have always done, only much faster. At the same time, it has given individuals the ability to transmit information quickly and widely without having to go through the processes of publication, of peer review, or any of the traditional gatekeeping methods that used to give some semblance of a guarantee that if it's between covers, then somebody must have thought it to be worth reading. We now have the opportunity for people to reach large audiences without regard to the quality or accuracy of what they are communicating. So far, it's just an ability. It's not a danger as long as there is an agreed upon way of sorting out the outcomes. As long as there is general acceptance of intellectual rules and standards by which images can be judged to be fake, or authentic information distinguished from disinformation, we are still okay. And for historians, this boils down to one word: evidence. Do you have it? If someone does, their ideas deserve consideration, even if they go against all traditional interpretations, even if they make some readers uncomfortable, even if they revolutionize the field. And on the other hand, if someone lacks evidence, then their ideas are not worthy of serious consideration, no matter how many times they are printed or posted or tweeted, or how authentic they appear in an electronic fake of some kind. Now, that standard for determining what history is worthy of consideration and what is not has held up since Herodotus. But in the 21st century, it has come under threat like never before. In San Francisco in 2020, a statue of Abraham Lincoln was vandalized. The reason given for this act was Lincoln's participation in the mass execution of 38 Sioux warriors during his presidency. The San Francisco School Board had at that time appointed a panel to recommend new names for schools. This was a panel from which they had consciously excluded anyone with historical credentials or training. The board subsequently voted to change the name of 44 schools, including one named for Abraham Lincoln. Neither the board nor its panel gave any consideration to the context of that mass execution, which occurred after the Sioux War of 1862. And as we heard, I think Craig Simons mentioned it earlier this week, the Drumhead court-martial had sentenced over 300 Sioux warriors to death, but Abraham Lincoln insisted on personally reviewing the cases and changed the sentences of 265 of them, saving them from the gallows. Critics pointed this out, and they also pointed out some blatant historical mistakes that the board had made in its reasoning for changing school names, but this made no difference. Even raising the idea of historical accuracy as a measure was regarded by some members of the board as unacceptable. Fortunately, public resistance in this case was strong enough to cause the school board to reverse its position 3 months later on the naming. But the central issue is that evidence was not seen as relevant to how decisions ought to be made. And another example of the contemporary war against evidence, the National Park Service took photographs to document the presidential inauguration of 2017. When the photos appeared to contradict the administration's claim that this had been the largest inaugural ever, instead of withdrawing that claim or presenting their own evidence to debate, the people speaking for the administration doubled down and asserted that their claim was an example of, quote, alternative facts, implying that false statements were no worse or different even from true ones. They were simply alternatives one could choose whenever it suited one's purpose. How would Lincoln fare in such a brave new world, where historical evidence no longer seemed to matter. Playing by the old rules, moderate Republican never-Trumpers enlisted Lincoln's image in their cause by forming the Lincoln Project, a political action committee. But the old rules no longer applied. In contrast to every previous president since 1865 who had uniformly paid respect to Lincoln, President Trump in June 2020 spoke dismissively of Lincoln, saying, quote, "So I think I've done more for the black community than any other president, and let's take a pass on Abraham Lincoln, because he did good, although it's always questionable." Even without specifying how he thought that Lincoln's good was questionable, this was a sharp break with past presidential regard for Lincoln. And in this context, it was not surprising that some of his supporters would embrace Confederate symbology. Now, one might hope that the world of Lincoln studies could weather the assault on evidence-based history by collectively reaffirming the validity of what historians do, seeking historical truth through evidence. But it's not altogether that easy, and indeed academic historians have to bear some share of the blame for concepts like alternative facts, because over the past 3 decades, most of us have understood and accepted postmodern objections to the idea that there exists a single, immutable truth about any historical topic. We revel instead in complexity and multiple interpretations. So to the careless observer or the casual student, it might seem that in denying we can ever establish the absolute truth about Lincoln or anything, we were therefore saying there is no truth at all. And that's on us as historians. We failed to make clear that the absence of absolute truth doesn't render everything else equally true or false. No historian can say with absolute certainty why the Confederates lost the Battle of Gettysburg. That's true, we can't say that. We don't have an absolute answer, but we can all agree that it was not because the Army of the Potomac had AK-47s. We can still distinguish between statements that have the possibility of truth and those that don't. Lincoln recognized that same logical flaw in people who attack the idea of equality. Opponents of equality had claimed that the founders couldn't have meant all men are created equal, really meant all men, because people were being held in slavery at the time. But Lincoln, in June 1857, acknowledged that, of course, absolute equality didn't exist in 1776, nor in his own time. And indeed, he said it might never be perfectly attained. But it was still, he said, a standard maxim for free society which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for. He saw that the impossibility of perfectly attaining an ideal was no reason for abandoning it. And the same applies to historical truth. In the current issue of the Abraham Lincoln Association Journal, there's a review of Michael Burlingame's book on Lincoln and race called The Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans and the Pursuit of Racial Equality. The reviewer is very favorable, agrees with the author's take on the subject, and that's what reviewers do. They give their opinion. That's fine. But, and that opinion is that Lincoln was not a white supremacist. But then rather than acknowledge that other scholars might hold competing legitimate views, the reviewer goes out of his way to insist that only he and Burlingame and those who agree with them are ones who actually probe the evidence. He admits that he can't imagine any other way to see this question. But then instead of modestly recognizing that perhaps it is his imagination that is limited, he concludes that anyone holding a contrary view must be blinded by emotion, closed-minded, and impervious to evidence, so there's no point arguing with them. To suggest that scholars like Brian Dirk and others who have written of the complexity of Lincoln's views on race aren't worthy of engaging just because you don't agree with them, that is to fall into the same pit of one-sided partisanship where so much political rhetoric has descended today. It's truly disappointing to see respected Lincoln scholars going down this path. or other scholars taking the king's shilling to serve on panels that produce political argument in place of serious history. But fortunately, most Lincoln historians have not done this. I want to close with 4 who have written about Lincoln in recent years as an example of how American politics could be better. Ed Acorn, in The Lincoln Miracle, Inside the Republican Convention That Changed History, published earlier this year, shows Lincoln as a candidate who emerged seemingly from nowhere, against the odds, at the time of the country's greatest needs. Could that happen again? Ted Widmer's book, Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, published in 2020, presents Lincoln now as president-elect, growing into his role, making himself known to the Northern people as the one they've been looking for, the one who can stand up to the Southern threat to the Republic. John Meacham, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle, published last year, has been described as giving us a Lincoln for our times. It focuses on Lincoln's moral growth and his willingness to do what was best for the country, even if it did not help his personal political interests. And finally, at the end of the war, John Avlon's book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, also published in 2022, covers the last weeks of the war. Avlon contrasts Lincoln with Andrew Johnson in a chapter about Johnson called The Anti-Lincoln. But in his description throughout the book of Lincoln's modesty, empathy, honesty, and self-deprecating humor, he invites the reader to see Lincoln as the anti-Trump. In 1837, discussing America's political institutions, Lincoln said, "At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer it, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher." He, of course, lived to see the threat of destruction from within realized in the Civil War. And since then, the United States has faced threats from Nazism, communism, terrorism, but always secure in the sense of national unity and the knowledge that secession has been permanently eliminated as a political option. Knowledge paid for with almost 800,000 lives, including Abraham Lincoln's. In that struggle, the Confederate battle flag never got closer to the national capital than the outskirts of Fort Stevens in 1864, where Lincoln may have glimpsed it from the ramparts. What would he have thought to see it wave within the Capitol in 2021? In that same Lyceum address, Lincoln had said, "There is no grievance that is a fit object of redress by mob law." I finished a recent interview with John Avlon with a question of whether there is any room for optimism at this time. Could we hope for another Lincoln? His answer was no. There's no reason to expect another Lincoln. But he said there was room for optimism if each of us could find a little more of Lincoln's virtues within ourselves. Thank you.
For a more in-depth discussion with this speaker, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.